Okay, welcome to this week's podcast. So it's another Monday, the 30th of June, actually. The longest day has just disappeared. So this week we're going to talk about spiritual free will and the higher self permission, basically. And the way that we cover that from from a clearing perspective, certainly from a spiritual perspective, because as we're kind of aware, all spiritual practitioners need to understand the concept of a person or a client's free will. And there's different methods that we can talk about and discuss as to how we obtain permission from the client and the way that we do things. So I'm just going to say hi to Agata. Good to see you. You're always the first, which means you're waiting in Singapore, which is good to hear. Jane's downstairs as well. There I am. Yep, okay. Well, I was just fighting with the tech to get StreamYard to work, which is always good. Interesting, actually, when we do these podcasts, because, of course, they're coming from a spiritual perspective, and we know that we're working alongside our spirit guides, in my case, obviously, Chen, who's very close, then effectively there is this kind of negative interference that we always need to have some sort of intervention on and for, I guess, to kind of override the tech challenges that can pop up. So I'll see Vanessa's joined. Hi, Vanessa, Tesla, and Agata, which is good. Okay, I think last week as well, I think there were some people on YouTube that were commenting, but I don't actually get to see the comments, oddly. So the only comments I can see, I think, generally coming from Facebook. Although in saying that, I think Tesla is on YouTube. So hopefully, Tesla, if I'm right, you actually are on YouTube, and I can see your comment, which is good. Because there were quite a lot of questions that were asked last week that we didn't really get round to answering because they didn't pop up on the comment feed that I get to see from a dashboard perspective in the StreamYard dashboard. Okay, Mary's arrived. Hi, Mary. Good to see you. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're talking about free will, basically, the concept of... thanks, Tesla. Good for you to confirm you can see it, or I can see you from YouTube, which is always good. So the concept being, we all know as spiritual practitioners, regardless really of what modality that we're talking about, whether it's hypnosis or the type of clearings that we do, that Chen does, or the type of clearings that we do from Spirit Release Academy perspective, we're always working with a client generally. And quite often the way that we tend to engage and work now is obviously it's a remote connection, it's a remote intervention. So we never actually get to see or speak to clients directly. They obviously invoke us through a website, through a kind of application booking program or format. And most practitioners that work remotely now, I think, are in this method whereby we don't really actually sit down with clients in the way that we used to, probably before COVID, I guess. So I guess we can kind of thank COVID for something. And one of those things is the concept that we all learnt, or we all provided a method to go online and try to continue running our different businesses online, rather than relying on people to actually pop into an office or into a room and jump on a healing couch. So the concept being spiritual free will and higher self-permission, really. So at the heart of both hypnosis practices and SRA clearings and the clearings that Chen does is this kind of profound concept of respect for free will, which we all know we need to do. And also that ends up overlying, I guess, with the sovereignty of each spirit or soul that we work with, depending upon your wording. So every individual, every client, every kind of recipient of the work that we do possesses that kind of innate right to choose their own experience, the timing and the path of the healing that they are about to undertake. And I think it's fair to say that practitioners in all spiritual fields really are taught to honour the concept deeply and we ensure that the interventions that we do, whether it's hands-on or remotely, align with the client's highest good and the client's spiritual and soul purpose. Because that's why we're doing this work, generally. We're doing this work because we actually want to help people. And helping people means we need to abide by these kind of universal laws that are kind of in place, and we need to understand them, and we need to work with them in the right way. I was going to say hi to Ashley and Anam. Good to see you from Austria, which is always good. That's Andreas. Yeah, cool. So basically, that's the kind of concept. So in hypnosis, we look at hypnosis the way that would work for a practitioner. And many of the practitioners that we work with, certainly from an SRA perspective, facilitators anyway, come in from that hypnosis background. So hypnosis is about kind of exploring that subconscious pattern, past lives, spiritual regressions, and the practitioner guides the client generally into kind of a highly receptive emotional, mental state. And they're obviously respecting free will. And of course, respecting free will is crucial. So as the client moves into that receptive state, we need to just check that there are no unintentional, try to avoid, I guess, unintentional imposing suggestions or interference with karmic lessons and those types of issues. So practitioners really are encouraged to seek permission from their client's higher self before initiating that kind of deep energetic and spiritual work. And that obviously is the way that many of these different hypnosis techniques work. And there's different types of techniques that we could talk about. We all know the names of them. So hypnosis generally requires permission from the client's higher self to actually engage in the type of healing and the work that they do. And obviously, they are ensuring effectively that the shifts that are going to happen kind of in alignment with the soul's readiness to accept the healing and the work. So if we go across now to kind of SRA, Spirit Release Academy, look at the way that we do things. Obviously, Spirit Release Academy and the way that Chen works too is the same. Obviously, Chen helped to work with Terry to kind of evolve the protocol that SRA uses today. So we kind of explicitly ask for higher self permission before we engage in any spiritual release or clearing work. But of course, it's done from our perspective by a spirit guide. So the spirit guide is actually connecting to the higher self of the client. So rather than the practitioner talking to the client in the way that hypnosis would work and asking to kind of receive that permission, spirit release work in the way that we work is actually being done, and the intervention is being done by spirit guides that are obviously in spirit. And of course, they have access to the client's higher self. So that's the foundational step, really, in the SRA protocols. And it kind of prevents disruption and important soul lessons and avoids kind of mimicking karmic entanglement for both practitioner and client. Because, again, we're working with spirit guides that understand what they're doing, how they do things. They know what they're trying to do. And, of course, that is the way that we perform those sort of interventions. So the spirit guide in our work is the kind of intermediary, really, helping the practitioners to communicate clearly with the client's higher self, and the spirit guides providing the answers back through mediums. And this, of course, helps with protection, helps to maintain a safe kind of high frequency space at the same time throughout the whole session. And again, by invoking the spirit guides, those practitioners using the SRA protocols are receiving clear answers and ensure that all the healing is kind of divinely guided and supported by spirit effectively. So ultimately, both hypnosis practitioners and SRA facilitators and mediums aren't really saviors for the client, really. They're merely kind of holding space and invoking the actual session. And by obtaining and prioritizing the higher self's permission and spiritual sovereignty, they kind of empower the clients really to reclaim their own healing space. And of course, it's about embodying the lessons for clients too, and trying to move forward really in their alignment with their own highest potential. So the role of the higher self really, as we live our daily lives, certainly from my perspective, we're trying to live through personality, ego. The higher self is kind of there as that kind of expansive, all-knowing aspect. The higher self is the kind of purest, I guess, expression of our soul or spirit's divine essence. And it kind of holds that broader perspective beyond space and time. And obviously the limitations that we have really as kind of human people. So the higher self is aware of soul contracts, it's aware of karmic lessons, life themes, and of course agreements, spiritual agreements and contracts that we've put in place, not just in this life, of course, but in other past lives too. So higher self has access to all of this information. And I think that's why things like hypnosis and spirit release is so prominent now in this field, certainly trying to help people with extreme mental health problems, because many of those problems are coming from some of these issues that can be resolved through that type of intervention that hypnosis and, of course, spirit release therapy and general clearing from spirit guides can kind of provide, really. So the kind of way that I kind of see the higher self, it's almost like a gatekeeper, really, to our sort of highest and deepest truths. And it's kind of the guardian, I guess, of our soul's evolution to a certain degree too. And of course, any spiritual intervention that we use or provide, if we're practitioners, has to honor the higher authority within each person, which of course is the higher self. So when practitioners are connecting with the client's higher self to ask permission before proceeding with interventions, they tend to ensure that they're healed and cleansed and clear themselves before they start. And of course, seeking that permission is certainly not just a formality. It's kind of an energetic handshake, I guess, between the kind of practitioner, the healer, and the soul, effectively, almost like a sacred agreement to collaborate for the highest good of the client or the recipient of the work. So for me, really, why permission kind of matters, I guess. So energetic integrity is the first thing. Healing work should be, if it's performed without consent, it can create kind of energetic entanglements between the practitioner and, of course, the client or recipient. It can also, I guess, probably cause karmic or psychic backlash too, which, of course, we don't want. So by honouring the permission, the practitioners maintain very clear boundaries, and they need to protect themselves from their clients and, of course, whatever's with the clients. And we all know that we talk about spirit attachments, entity and discarnate attachments a lot in Spirit Release Academy work, and obviously the work that we do as practitioners working with Chen and spirit guides. So we don't really want anything connected to the client to kind of rebound onto us either, because as a practitioner we need to keep ourselves sovereign too, and of course safe, really. So of course, if we talk about empowerment, I guess, rather than dependency. So when the healing's done without permission, it can foster some sort of dependency from the client to the practitioner, which is disempowerment, really, of the client, effectively. And in that way, if we look at it kind of, instead of permission-based work, we're empowering the client to engage actively in their own healing journey. So we want to do this work, if we can, consciously with the client's agreement. And then we think about spiritual laws and ethics generally. Spiritual laws governing free will are kind of foundational in most traditions, certainly in most practitioners and healing modalities. And certainly if we look across at the esoteric teachings and universal spiritual law, we know that practitioners who honour these laws are operating to a higher ethical standard. So permission kind of is beyond words. Some might think that it's verbal or conscious permission is enough. Well, this is important. It's kind of one layer, I guess. Spiritual permission needs to be sought at multiple levels, really. So we kind of have got the conscious layer, where the client actually asks for healing, for the work. So they kind of openly ask to receive healing and intervention. So that's the conscious aspect. And then the subconscious layer, the practitioner intuitively checks for hidden resistance or unspoken fears, is another way to view that. And of course, effectively the higher self level is where the practitioner is asking the client's higher self, above the conscious awareness of the client, to engage with the intervention and obviously spiritual team effectively for kind of final approval, really. So I think if permission is kind of denied, it's kind of crucial that we respect that from the higher self's perspective. And some practitioners may support the client with preparatory work or, I don't know, empowerment practices, general guidance until they're ready. And certainly, again, when we're teaching our practitioners from an SRA perspective, that we need to make sure that the spirit guide has obtained the permission from the higher self to do the work, basically. And this is where the SRA protocols kind of cover free will, and they're respecting spiritual sovereignty. And that is a foundational principle from our perspective in the SRA work that we do, and certainly the work that we do working with Chen, clearing clients on a kind of regular basis, is that no entity attachment or energy is cleared or released, really, without the explicit higher self permission, which has been provided to the spirit guide. So the problem, I guess, we could talk about, which we talk about quite often, negative attachment. So how can they circumvent the work that we're all trying to do? So all spiritual practitioners are trying to engage with clients, obviously take them on a healing journey. Clients are booking sessions because they have problems and issues and emotional state problems, maybe mental health problems, that kind of thing. And we know that negative attachments can block, really, or distort the access to the higher self. And this, of course, is one of the problems, really, I think, in some of these other modalities, especially hypnosis being one, really, is that in hypnosis, especially when people are exploring that subconscious pattern, past lives, spiritual regressions, the practitioner is guiding the client into these kind of highly receptive states and respecting the free will, which of course is crucial to avoid unintentionally imposing suggestions or interfering with karmic lessons. So practitioners are encouraged, I guess, to speak about permission and to gain that from the higher self before they do the work, and whilst they're kind of performing that intervention. However, one of the problems, I guess, is that many hypnosis practitioners are going to find that they encounter significant challenge when entities or attachments are intrusive and present. So they can block, of course, or distort the access to the higher self. And we see this quite often, is that entities will basically provide a block between the practitioner and effectively the higher self, so that practitioners cannot get that kind of agreement from the higher self to actually perform the work. And if we think about the way that entities and attachments work, is they're connected to someone because they're parasitic in nature, they're feeding off people's energy. And the last thing they want is a practitioner from any modality to turn up and basically connect the client back to their higher self, and obviously to remove the attachment. So they're there to stop that happening if they can. And of course, what they tend to do is they interfere with the communication process. So practitioners can't connect to the higher self, the client can't connect to their higher self either. And of course, quite often, some of those hypnosis sessions and other modalities will then effectively be kind of very short-lived, because you can't get the higher self's permission. Whereas in the way that we work, this was the method that Chen came up with years ago, working with Dr. Palmer, was to circumvent the client altogether. So we don't really connect to the client per se. When we perform clearings, we're connecting to a spirit guide as a medium, and the spirit guide is connecting to the higher self of the client. So even if there's an entity attachment in the way that's obscuring the connection, it doesn't make any difference to the way that we work. We still provide or obtain the agreement from the client's higher self to go ahead with the healing or the clearing, if it's spirit clearing work. And then, of course, the spirit guide will come along effectively with the spirit guide team, perform the intervention and remove and clear the attachments, whether they be entity attachments or, of course, discarnate spirit attachments, people that were once alive and have died. So the SRA method is almost like a prerequisite to hypnosis for some people. And we certainly know quite a few hypnosis practitioners that if they have a problem client, or a client they suspect to have quite severe mental health problems, maybe hearing voices, intrusive thoughts, that kind of thing, schizophrenia, then they perform, or they will invoke us to perform an intervention first to clear the field, effectively remove the attachments and the entities, and get that client back connected to their higher self. And then when that session's been complete, the hypnosis practitioner or other modality can then go about their normal practice. And obviously they've got access now straight to the higher self of the client. So that kind of sidesteps and removes the blockage that's been put in place by these negative entities that are trying to interfere with that communication method, basically. And that makes it a much easier process from that perspective. And this is why we think that the SRA work that we're teaching practitioners to do should almost be a prerequisite to every healing modality, really, because many people have got things connected to them they don't know about. And of course, it's changing their life in a very negative way. And even if you come in and try to perform a modality on a person to heal them and help them, if that person has attachments connected that are not being cleared, observed, or removed, then effectively the healing's only going to be so good, because of course you've still got this kind of parasitic energy connected to a person that's very negative. So the SRA protocols really sidestep all of those blockages kind of safely and effectively. And of course, it's also safe for the practitioners, because SRA practitioners need to be safe in the work that they do. And this is the reason that we work with spirit guides. Effectively, we kind of push the spirit guides into the front line. They take the flak, and they do get attacked too quite often by entities and things that are connected to clients. But the facilitator and mediums in the SRA work effectively are sidestepping that problem, because they're not directly engaging with the client's energy. They're not connecting to the client. The spirit guide is the front line, basically, that's taking and removing and clearing anything that's negatively connected. And this is the reason that we work in teams, really, a spirit guide, a medium, and a facilitator, because that team of three is extremely powerful, especially when you have very highly evolved spirit guides stepping in to do the work on our behalf, really. And I know from my perspective, when I used to do spirit clearing work before sending Chen in, really, I know myself that you get attacked often. There's a lot of psychic problems. There's all sorts of issues that come up to you and your family as a practitioner walking into that very negative space where people have got entities and things attached. People are possessed by very negative things. So this method is so safe because, again, the practitioners don't really put themselves in the firing line at all. So I think that's kind of my conclusion to this conversation. We'll get Chen in a moment to give his opinion of things, really. So in the kind of the realm of spiritual healing and intervention, I guess free will and higher self permissions are not really abstract concepts per se. I think they're sacred pillars of ethical practice by ethical practitioners. And they kind of remind us that each client or recipient is a soul on its unique journey. It's kind of perfectly designed for its growth awakening, even if they're going through some very difficult experiences. And I think practitioners who honour the principles stand as true allies to the spirit and soul, really facilitating rather than directing, supporting rather than controlling, I think is the general understanding. And that way we kind of co-create with the higher self, this kind of dance of trust, respect, and effectively divine love to actually allow someone to move into a healing space and to put them on that healing journey. So I think through that kind of lens, the healing becomes a profound co-creation, I guess, an act with spirit empowering, and each person kind of remembers their inherent divinity, basically to reclaim their spiritual sovereignty, because that's what we're really talking about, is that clients need to be spiritually sovereign, which means they need to have full sovereignty over their energy. And that means that there cannot be anything connected to them that's parasitic in nature or obviously filtering their energy in any way, really. So I'm just going to go across to the chat. So hi Kira, good to see you. Mary, Vanessa, Jane's just talking about dog barking. Yeah, of course the bell always rings when we do these. So the bell never rings all day basically until I go live, and then as soon as I go live we can guarantee the bell will ring someone at the door. But that's kind of the way we work. It's authentic, it's real, happens to us all, so we just work through those things. Hi to Nadine and Veronica, good to see you guys. Okay, so let's get Chen to come in. I'm just going to set a timer for a moment, because we all know that Chen does need a few boundaries at times, especially those of you that have met Chen in the SRA sessions. You know what we're up against, basically. And Jane certainly knows, because she sees it just about every day. Okay. Okay, as you might have noticed, I'm starting to look quite warm because I'm trapped in a very small room, i.e. my office, and the sun's actually come out in the UK now. I think it's 31 degrees outside, and it's quite hot in here. So if I look like I'm melting, I probably am. But hopefully it won't affect Chen too much, really. Okay, right then, we'll just hand over. Good day to you all. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to find the time to listen to these particular conversations and podcasts. So from my perspective, obviously this is a very important topic and subject, and one that everyone needs to be observant of when you're working with anyone, really, certainly from a spiritual perspective. But it's good to understand that even in your daily lives, as you go about your daily life and you're interacting with people, whether those people are people that you work with or people you have acquaintances with or people, of course, that you could be in relationships with, there is this concept that each individual, as Andrew says, soul and spirit should be walking in pure spiritual sovereignty. But of course, as a matter of fact, if we look at most of the people on the planet, my guess would be that probably 90% of them at least, certainly adults, have lost spiritual sovereignty. And that means that there are issues around their energetics, their etheric field, whereby things have attached to them. So these are basically negative energies, different parasitic energies. As Andrew said earlier, there could be entities, they could be discarnate spirits. I, of course, myself am a discarnate spirit. And in this format, I'm effectively possessing, although positively possessing, the physical body of young Andrew, of course. So this is what we see here. We see young Andrew, what he calls himself, in trance, and a discarnate entity, myself, Chen, come in and positively possess the body to be able to communicate with you all in this particular method. So thinking about your lives and the people that are sat around you right now, if you look people in the eye is, of course, that window to the soul. We all know that this is the case. And we know that if people have negative attachments or negative things in their field or connected to them, then generally those negative things are looking back at you. And this is where you'll see people become uncomfortable. Generally, they'll look away, or they might start to become irritated and maybe even become quite negative or abusive. So all of you that are listening to this, by default, of course, are light workers. And we talked about you last week. I believe light workers was the topic of conversation for the podcast. So people that embody light, walk in the light, you walk with a high vibration. All of you will be going through difficult, traumatic lives generally in your personal lives, because this is what you're here to do. You're here to work through different problems from a spiritual perspective. But coming back to the concepts of free will, you obviously incarnated onto planet Earth with free will. So you came in with free will, and you probably came in with spiritual sovereignty. And as I say, most adults do not continue to maintain spiritual sovereignty because of life choices, things that they do, people they get involved with. So there is this concept of universal law. Now, people talk about universal law, but what does that really mean? Obviously, every planet and every ecosystem has a subset of spiritual laws that are overlaid onto the vibration. So if you think about planet Earth, the planet you all live on, otherwise known as Gaia from a spiritual perspective, this has a frequency net around it effectively, and that frequency net is imbued with certain laws. So other spiritual entities and energies, before they try to come in to this ecosystem, have to, in theory, abide by some of those laws. But of course, there are entities that exist in the frequencies contained around planet Earth that don't abide by law. But let's just assume that every spiritual entity on the planet or in the planet is vibrating with that subset of laws, and they know what that subset of laws are. And one of them, of course, is your free will. So you have free will to make your own decisions about anything that you do from a personal perspective, but merely free will, really, and spiritual universal laws are overlaid with how you interact with other people. So if you are interacting with people in your family, people you work with, your general acquaintances in a positive way, and you do so with integrity and you speak your truth, then of course you're working within the framework and the boundaries of those spiritual universal laws. Now let's just say you did something, you took someone prisoner and treated them very badly and did something very bad to them, then that doesn't really work with the universal law concept, because you've overridden their free will. And when we look at things like wars and those types of things, they don't work very well with free will, because you have an army that generally takes over a different country and then treats the occupants of that country very badly, or obviously kills many, many people. And of course, those people effectively would have had their free will and their universal laws taken away from them, because they haven't really agreed to some of those things. Obviously, we've got the karmic mesh that we can overlay. So some people that live in certain places will be going through those types of trials and tribulations, wars and such like, to equalize karmic debts that have happened from past lives and previous lives. So the whole concept of karma, when it's overlaid with spiritual free will and spiritual sovereignty, can become quite difficult and quite messy to explain and understand. But the general concepts are, we're talking about free will from a client perspective when you're working with clients. So gaining someone's permission to do something is, of course, very, very important. And really, there should be no work undertaken by any spiritual practitioner that doesn't actually have a green light from either the client from a conscious perspective, or of course the client's higher self. And this was the way that I found that we could navigate some of the problems that we used to see. So when I first started to engage and work with young Andrew and Dr. Terence Palmer, one of the big problems was, of course, Mr. Palmer came from the hypnosis background. So he was very au fait and very switched on to understand how to ask for permission from a client's higher self. And this is the way that he was taught. And of course, this is the way that he practiced. When we overlaid that with spiritual possession, of course, that model didn't work at all. Because when we have a client or a person that is effectively possessed or has negative attachments connected to them, that is possessing them, that has taken over some of the conscious awareness, or that is controlling them from behind the scenes, almost like a puppet master would control a puppet with strings. The same thing has happened energetically to people that have attachments. You have an energy there that's changing the thought process, changing the emotional state, changing the things that the person hears, and of course the way that they react. So what we found is we couldn't actually provide what we called sovereignty to the client using that conscious method. And we spent quite a lot of time, probably years actually, trying to work out how we could circumvent this problem. And that for me meant that I needed to speak to the higher councils that are in charge of planet Earth, that exist to look at this mesh. They watch what's going on to a certain degree. And of course, these spiritual frameworks and laws that we talk about need to be adhered to. So I, as a positive spiritual entity working with a team too, of course, needed to find a way that we could circumvent this concept of conscious agreement for spiritual work. And that was when we realized that we as a spiritual entity had the advantage over a 3D physical human practitioner, because of course we could go straight to the higher self. And if there are entity attachments, or if there is any overlaid negativity that's blocking that connection, that didn't stop us. We could still connect to the vibration of the core conscious awareness, which of course is the higher self effectively. So when we realized this was certainly an opportunity, so we still were working inside the framework of spiritual laws, and we still were adhering to free will of the client, but we could perform and obtain consent from the higher self. And then, of course, that could be pushed back through a medium to the practitioners. So this is where, of course, young Andrew and young Terence would basically get the green light from my perspective. So Terry or Terence would ask, do we have conscious agreement or subconscious agreement or agreement from the higher self? Young Andrew would connect to myself. I would basically go straight to source. We were always working for the highest good of the client. And that means that 99.9% of the time, the higher self will always provide agreement, because of course the higher self's job is to work for the highest good of the spirit and the soul. So when we have a possessed energy or a possessing entity, a parasitic entity connected to a client, then of course the higher self is always going to provide permission, because we're working in a very high vibratory state with integrity and with truth. And this would mean, of course, that we could then clear these layers of negativity. We could basically depossess the client, remove the attachments, and then we used to find all sorts of other things connected into the etheric field. And this is where the SRA protocols came out, basically, or the protocols that young Terence and Andrew and myself worked with initially. We realized that we could create a protocol. We could look for different vibratory frequencies. Each one of them needed to be cleared and removed. And this way we were not circumventing free will, we were obtaining permission from the higher self, and we were still respecting free will. And this was quite a big step, really, from our perspective. And I'm quite sure that I don't actually know of too many other modalities operating today on planet Earth that are working so closely with spirit guides and providing the consent from behind the scenes. Most modalities, again, are trying to connect to clients. And of course, a client that's possessed, that has attached entities, will never be able to give permission. And of course, if we think about clients in different states too, some of the clients that we work with, of course, are in mental institutions. So they've been sectioned, so they've lost their free will, really. And of course, the state has overtaken or embraced them into a subset of laws that are there to section them and put them in some sort of quarantine, if you like, spiritual quarantine, whilst they're being worked on, taking them out of the general population. So of course that person is not really able to connect with practitioners and ask for help, but their families of course can. And this was one of the reasons that we wanted to find a robust method of obtaining permission from the higher self for people that weren't able to give it themselves. People in coma, of course, too. So if someone's involved in a car accident and they have attached energies, or they don't have their conscious awareness because the spiritual vibratory frequency has lost connection to the physical carrier, so therefore they're in a coma state, they can still be alive. Obviously, the physical body is still kept alive and maintained by medical science. And then, of course, if the spiritual vibration is still in the actual, or still connected to the physical body, then that person should be able to talk. And of course, a practitioner of these types of modalities can connect to that person's higher self that's in a coma. And we all know that mediums should be able to connect too. So we've done quite a bit of work in the past where young Andrew, as a medium, would connect to the spiritual intelligence of someone in a coma and have a conversation and ask them why they're not able to articulate their body, why they can't move the physicality, why and what's stopping them coming out of coma. And of course, there are many different things, and we could explore this in a different conversation. But the general concept being, there are many types of situations where trying to get conscious consent is very difficult, if not impossible. And of course, these methods, as we said, circumvent that to allow the spiritual intervention that we need to perform. So hopefully that covers the concepts quite well, really. From my perspective, it's certainly quite a simple conversation, but it's one that everyone needs to understand. And we all know that practitioners that are being trained in different modalities all need to understand the concepts of free will from a client perspective, and also permission, whether that be conscious. If it's not conscious permission, then of course there has to be permission gained from somewhere, and the only place that can be is from the higher self. So if we looked at a situation where maybe a child needed some type of intervention, and the parents tried to book a session or did book a session with a practitioner, the parents don't have sovereignty over that child. They don't have free will and control either over that child. It might be the mother's child, but the child still has its own spiritual envelope, effectively, that needs to be taken into assessment, because the child might be going through a difficult karmic lesson. So again, just because a mother has booked a session or some sort of hypnosis or some sort of other practitioner session to clear or perform healing for the child, the client needs to still give permission itself. And of course, that has to be either conscious. If a child's too young to do that, it doesn't know what it's doing, so it won't be able to provide conscious permission from a spiritual perspective. And again, this is where a spirit guide connecting to the client's child's higher self, in this case, would obviously obtain that permission. So it's very important to consider this if you're a practitioner, that if people are booking your sessions, trying to obtain permission has to be one of two ways: either conscious permission, where they know what they're booking and they're booking it, so that would tick the conscious permission box. If that isn't in place or can't happen for different reasons, then in a way you need to be able to get to the higher self of the person that you're working with to provide and give you that permission. Otherwise, of course, as young Andrew said at the start of this conversation, there are situations where you become karmically entangled with someone that you're working with, because effectively you're overriding universal law, you're overriding permission in different ways to actually perform work and healing. And if that person had come in and planned to go through, let's say, a very painful and difficult disease for most of their life, and this is what they wanted on their life path, really, if you come along as an amazing practitioner and a healer, and you perform an intervention and heal that client, you've just taken them off the path that they set themselves on. And of course, the client spirit guides also, their job is to maintain that spiritual path. So the key things that you picked to experience when you came in, and for some of you that might be pain, long-term illnesses, all sorts of things are going to be in that list. If someone comes along and intervenes on your behalf, doing what could be concerned or considered to be the right thing, it will be the wrong thing from that person's spiritual path. And of course, the spirit guides effectively their job is to try to put you in the right place for you to obtain and go through these different types of experience in your life. So it wouldn't work too well from that perspective either. And this is what practitioners need to consider when we're thinking about permissions and free will. And of course, that conversation can go in all sorts of different ways with different opinions and ideas. But generally, there are only two paths. There is the conscious permission from the person that's receiving the healing, and then there's the higher self permission that is the only other aspect. Anything else is overstep, really, from our perspective. And of course, we know many other modalities. If we look at shamanic work, that shamanic practitioner will journey, again, trying to get to the higher self or connect to the higher self. So there's lots of different modalities with different people around the world doing different things. But effectively, permission has to be really obtained in one of two ways, consciously or through higher self. And if that's not done, then of course there is this karmic retribution and entanglement that starts to happen with practitioners. And if we look at practitioners that are overstepping, they're connecting themselves energetically to their clients. And of course, many of them actually become quite ill themselves because, of course, they'll start to experience some of the problems that their clients have. And we all know, we see this quite often with practitioners, that if you don't cleanse yourself and keep yourself sovereign in that protected space, then as you grow older, you're working on more and more clients. If all of those clients leave some residue on you from a psychic and spiritual perspective, then of course you'll get to a point whereby that residue becomes quite weighty and starts to weigh you down. And that will affect your mental health and of course your physical health too. And we all know that practitioners need other practitioners to clear them. So it seems to be almost like the curse of being a spiritual practitioner, that you can't clear and clean yourself. It's always good to have someone else that you trust, that works with integrity and speaks their truth, and you keep each other clear, you keep each other sovereign. And this again was one of the key components of the work and the protocol that Dr. Palmer developed with young Andrew, is that we end up with teams of people that are looking after each other, because walking this path, certainly the spiritual path, is quite lonely, as most of you will be aware. But trying to do that and keep yourself clear and work with clients on a day-to-day basis to heal and help them is almost an impossible task, really. And people that try to do that will find that they will suffer from, again, this spiritual residue that sticks to the etheric field, weighs you down, causes you health problems. And of course, mental health is obviously connected to that too. So I think from my perspective, we've answered, or I've certainly covered or answered most of the questions. Conversation from his perspective is slightly different, as we would expect, but covers the same types of things. And obviously what we've tried to do is to cover different modalities here. So we've talked about the way that I work with young Andrew, obviously clearing people's energy fields, bringing them back to a sovereign state. We've covered modalities like hypnosis, which of course generally, again, connecting to the higher self. And then we've covered the Spirit Release Academy concept of how we work and why that work is so successful. And also, as we did say, that almost this could be a prerequisite. So if we look forward on a timeline over the next 5 to 10 years, we are expecting that people will become more spiritually aware. There is obviously a spiritual awakening happening at the moment on planet Earth. And when people understand how important their own sovereignty is, the same way that you wash yourselves on a daily basis to keep physically clean, you have to wash yourself spiritually to keep clean. And of course, when you're working as a practitioner with clients, if they're coming into your space and they have attachments and negative things in their field, then if you're not able to clear and remove those things, one is that you put yourself at risk, and two, of course, the actual level of healing will be probably greatly reduced compared to how it would be if they were coming in sovereign and they were actually in their own mind space connected to themselves. And that, of course, is a key consideration that we need to discuss and talk about. So I will say thank you very much for finding the time to listen, and to all of those people that listen to this in catch-up mode. Hopefully it's been an engaged and intellectually exciting conversation, providing answers to some of the most fundamental questions from a spiritual perspective, that of free will and that of spiritual permission. So I will say good day to you, and I will bring in Andrew back, and we will look forward to next week's conversation. Goodbye. Okay, so I'm back. Oh, Chen's finished early. This has become a little routine now. 1 minute early. Okay, so hopefully you guys enjoyed that chat. Not that I know exactly what Chen's talking about, but I'll watch it and catch up like everybody else. In fact, I don't watch some of these in catch up now because we're so busy. I don't get around to listening to some of these things. So when I do, of course, if I'm driving somewhere in the car, I think it's quite a good opportunity to listen to some of the things that Chen has to say, which will be good. I think Suki's joined. It's good to see you, Suki. And you're on the SRA training, so this is going to be a very important topic from your perspective, really, that we cover on the practitioner training. And also Ashley and Chen, which is good. Cool. And Evie, I think Evie's here too. So hi to you. Okay, hopefully I've covered everyone that's popped up. And Nadine and Veronica. I think I did mention you two earlier. I saw you on there. So thanks for joining. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed the chat. I'm going to go and open the door because it's very hot in here, unusually. Suddenly the UK's turned into California, which is quite nice, except we've got houses that are built with loads of insulation and thick carpets generally to keep us warm. So we're all boiling instead. Okay, I'll say goodbye and we'll catch you again next week. Bye, folks.